Okay, there we go. All right, so the first section touches upon some stuff like we have talked about, like how the Constitution doesn't just occur like in a vacuum, as they say, just kind of like out of thin air. All right, there's some historical like the things that we talked about in chapters 2, where the Constitution, much like the Declaration of Independence, has some kind of things like in kind of English kind of like legal tradition and such. All right. So the first thing with this chapter is just a definition of what the U.S. Constitution is. And we've talked about just constitutions in general. All right. We aren't the only country that has a constitution, but a constitution is simply kind of a written form of government, basically outlining what a government is, kind of like their kind of plan on how to govern. The U.S. Constitution, the definition is agreement here, right? And that's a lot of the times it's like kind of this idea of like consent comes from the people that we had talked about. This idea that the people will grant powers to the government, as so to speak. So it's a kind of relationship here, a symbiotic relationship. That's the idea. Again, when we talk about this stuff, these are like heavy. When we talk about like values and ideals, right? Ideals are something to kind of strive for. Like, I have an ideal, like kind of like body weight at some point. Do I always reach that? Absolutely not. All right. And so like you have goals, right? That's kind of the idea behind that. All right. And like I said, the U.S. Constitution, much like the Declaration of Independence we talked about, has some like kind of like looks back to our kind of tradition, particularly when we talk about kind of like British government and stuff like that. We had talked about how like, the Declaration of Independence was somewhat kind of influenced by things like the Magna Carta and that. Same thing with the U.S. Constitution. So, and again, this is something that you guys, this stuff is things you probably had talked about the last time you took the Constitution test, right? And so, I'll go back there. So there's the image of the Constitution. Did you guys, when I was going to school, I remember when I was a kid, we had to recite like the preamble and all those stuff. Did you guys have to do that in like grade school, middle school? Did they make you ever do that? Yeah. Did it make you so many classes that we had to do that? I actually like in college, like for like a history degree, I had to take a kind of a one-on-one class. We had a Constitution test as well. I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. Our professor basically, he hands us blank sheets of paper and he says, write out the Constitution in your own words. It's like, that's the laziest test I've ever gotten. Like, so we had to go through articles and stuff like that. I'm not going to make you guys do that ever. All right. I promise. I won't make you guys recite anything or kind of write that stuff out there. But we, again, we'll talk about different articles and things of that nature. But some historical documents that are going to influence the Constitution. And the founders didn't really have to look too far. They didn't really necessarily have to look all the way to England. They could look closer to home. One of the first ones is something called the Mayflower Compact. All right. And this is kind of tied in with their whole story of Thanksgiving and stuff like that. So what we were talking about in chapter 2, we were talking about kind of how, the colonization of the Americas and how, the English, had basically colonized kind of like the eastern seaboard there, stretching from what is like kind of Maine, Massachusetts, all the way down to Georgia and that. And so a lot of times these are individuals who are basically going to the frontier, if you will. They're basically kind of like, colonizing here. A lot of them are kind of what we refer to as they're religious refugees to a certain extent. All right. And so there's that famous story in 1620, the kind of what we refer to as pilgrims, right? Kind of made their way. They were kind of basically sailing from England. At one point, they made a stop in the Netherlands. Pilgrims were kind of a form of what we refer to as Anabaptists that are very similar to, let's say, Amish and other people. These are people that tended to believe in adult kind of baptism and that. This during the kind of Protestant Reformation, they were kind of viewed as somewhat of basically kind of weirdos to a certain extent. All right. And so these people were leaving places like England to look for kind of how they wanted to basically kind of like practice their religion. All right. And so, again, traveling around, like basically making this journey across the Atlantic. These are kind of like these kind of like agreements that they sign are essentially kind of, they are for survival for the most part and how to govern within like kind of a small community on a place that's like the equivalent of going to the moon for the most part. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this kind of little video that kind of talks about this from the PBS series American Experience, which kind of talks a little bit about the journey that the Pilgrims made and the significance of the agreement that they all signed amongst the 41 members signed amongst them with the Mayflower Compact.
Summer was fading fast, and the window for attempting the long and dangerous ocean crossing had already started to close, when on September 6, 1620, an aging 180-ton ship called the Mayflower set out on her own across the North Atlantic on what would prove to be one of the most historic voyages of the millennium.
They weren't the people that you would expect to be founding a new colony. At least half of them were separatists, that is to say, radical Protestants who were religious exiles, who had been living in Leiden, the Dutch Republic.
Suddenly, these Leideners, who had spent 10 years cultivating their own spiritual, very inward bond, found themselves on a ship sharing their space with strangers.
Undersupplied and overcrowded, and with the strangers the investors had insisted go with them. The Mayflower left Plymouth Harbor off the south coast of England. William Bradford remembered her finally setting forth under a prosperous wind.
And so they left. But they knew they were pilgrims and looked not much on these things, but lift up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country.
If you wanted to go to America, you should try to leave February or March at the latest, so you could get there in the spring and give yourself a full spring and summer to become accustomed to the new world and to do all the things you had to do before the winter set in. In fact, of course, they ended up leaving in September, which was about as bad as you could be.
Early on the morning of Thursday, November 9th, 1620, after more than 2 months at sea, a crew member spied a line of high bluffs. It was the first land they had seen in 65 days. But even before they dropped anchor, long festering tensions between the strangers and the pilgrims broke out into the open. Many of the strangers began to speak openly of splintering off and going their own way once they came ashore.
This day, before we came to harbour, observing some not well affected to unity and concord, gave some appearance of faction. It was thought good there should be an association and agreement, but we should combine together in one body and submit to such government and governors as we should by common consent agree to make and choose, and set our hands to this that follows, word for word.
On the morning of November 11th, 1620, the Mayflower Compact was offered up for signature. The vast majority of the men on board put their names to the paper, stating that they agreed to combine themselves together into a civil body politic with the power to enact whatever laws proved necessary to preserve the group. Years later, when William Bradford and others codified the rules of Plymouth Colony in a new book of laws, on the very first page, they described the compact as a solemn and binding combination, whose authority came from the fact that it was based upon the vote of the governed.
So this is a kind of later famous painting of the kind of signing of the compact, which they focus on 41 men who are on board. Again, this is still kind of a male-dominated kind of culture here. Sign this, and the importance with this here is this is basically, and they're not independent. They're basically this is an extension of, like, at the time King James of England they were granted. But the idea that these were kind of laws placed out. This is kind of like a contract on kind of proper conduct, if you will. All right, but this is essentially going to kind of like when the framers of the Constitution are going to look towards this, and there's Plymouth right there at the kind of the top of the kind of the map right here, where the supposed landing. They have like even where they claim the rock in which they first put step upon, Plymouth Rock, right? But the importance with this was this idea, this concept that we were going to place into the kind of the Constitution, the concept of popular sovereignty. Sovereignty means to reign, like kind of term, kind of a fancy term for like kind of ruling or reigning. And the idea is that consent of the governed. All right, the right comes from the people. So the kind of laws laid out that we're going to basically kind of dictate behavior on and the kind of the Plymouth colony, were basically this came from the people that were kind of directly signing it. All right, so this is like maybe like a smaller version, maybe kind of a direct democracy to a certain extent. Also, another thing in there is they added kind of what we refer to as a preamble, an introduction, right, to that, and it was basically like. And there was, you could see the religious sense to it, like it mentions God, and the first sentence says Amen, and that. But it's an introduction to what they're essentially kind of outlaying for the colony. So the Constitution, before we get into the articles, there's a preamble: "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, tranquility, liberty, all that other stuff." So that has a kind of direct kind of correlation in with the Mayflower Compact. Another kind of early kind of a contract signed by early settlers a little bit later in 1639. And so like the Pilgrims of Plymouth were the first like kind of settlers to kind of reach the Americas. You talked about like in grade school, you talked about like kind of Roanoke and Jamestown and such like that. But in what they call the Connecticut River towns, all right, which becomes the state of Connecticut, you had a similar thing with the Mayflower Compact, where it's a little bit more detailed, particularly on kind of giving individual rights to those who are kind of basically in the settlement. They call it the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Now, a historian, and this is somewhat debatable, claims that this is actually a truer kind of form of a constitution, if you will, all right, because it gives more kind of like stately rights that people have within that. So Connecticut, the license plate on Connecticut say the Constitution state. That's related to this, all right, for that sense. They're both very similar in the sense they're basically kind of like small communities, relatively small communities, and basically kind of laying out in written form, like what are the parameters of society in those areas, all right? And so a lot of the individual rights that we're going to see, let's say in the Bill of Rights, there's going to be some direct correlation with that with the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And then another one that obviously the framers of the Constitution could cite because there was a contemporary that had written about this was the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. This was written by Thomas Jefferson when he was a delegate in Virginia, in the Virginia Assembly there. And so it kind of specifically states that kind of government has no right to impose, would coerce, or try to like kind of convince people or interfere with religious practice. All right. So this becomes like kind of a influence on what amendment gives, the right to freedom of religion. You guys remember what amendment that is? It's a number amendment. I'll give you a choice. Is it First or Second Amendment? First Amendment. Good job. All right. So we'll talk about specific amendments here. The First Amendment has a direct kind of correlation there with kind of like the kind of Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Keep in mind, Thomas Jefferson wasn't at the Constitutional Convention. So when the framers of the Constitution left, they did not have the Bill of Rights put into the Constitution. That's why in an amendment we talk about a change to it. And so Jefferson was one of the big vocal kind of anti-federalists in the sense that the government doesn't go as far enough to something like it was stated out in the kind of Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Now, the goals of the U.S. Constitution, again, ideals and goals are kind of like go hand in hand to a certain extent. And some of this comes from these kind of like these charters and these compacts and that. One is limited government, right? Government with specific restrictions on its power, right? And again, keep in mind, we, the framers of the Constitution, a lot of them were signers of the Declaration of Independence. This new government, while it's replacing the Articles of Confederation, still want to kind of place some limits on where they don't want to have an autocratic monarch that's basically this idea of limited government, right, is important. Majority rule. Majority means like in a sense of democracy, you have to have a majority minority. Majority of those who are ones who kind of win out of the vote. The principle that kind of disagreement, everyone will accept the decision of most of the people. All right, this becomes a basis for things like elections, right? And that idea there. So majority rule is important because we have to come to like a consensus that to get things done, you have to have some sense of kind of consensus. And then another one though is minority rights. All right, while the majority may win out the argument or win out a vote, if you will, based on numbers, the Constitution puts in there kind of protects for the minority, meaning those who kind of like in the numbers are still able to kind of express their views freely and make their voices heard. That they're not basically kind of run ragshot, if you will. All right, and so things that we're kind of in the news today, like when we talk about like Congress, we talk about something called a filibuster. This idea for the minority kind of like party in Congress to kind of basically get their voices heard by kind of trying to hold up legislation. While we kind of view it as something that's maybe somewhat negative, it's also kind of instilled into the Constitution with this concept of minority rights. Powers of the people, again, this whole idea of rights that basically consent comes from the government. A lot of this is going to be put into the Bill of Rights when we talk about amendments, not just like the First Amendment, but amendments like Second Amendment, right to bear arms. Things like your right to what we call due process, the process of basically kind of getting a fair trial, the concept of justice and stuff like that. And also too, this idea that powers come from the people through elections, right? People have that right to kind of elect their leaders. Now, the framers of the Constitution also put like kind of these stopgap measures in there because they weren't always they didn't always trust what we call the yeoman farmer. So we'll talk about things like the Electoral College and stuff like that. It does put a little bit of kind of like parameters and a little bit of kind of halt on the actual total power of the people, if you will. And then something that is, when we kind of get a little detail here, this concept of a federalist system. And I talked a little bit about this in chapter 2. Federal, whenever you hear the term federal government, that's the national government. Federal government is basically, the one based in Washington. So the federalism and the federal system here is this idea that the federal government has powers, certain rights, and kind of things that they do. The state governments do as well, and then they both have powers that kind of overlap one another. All right, and so this plays a key role in kind of like the Constitution here, and this idea of kind of what we call federalism, the federal system there. This is somewhat of a concession because our Confederation basically states had a little bit more power than the federal government. Here, we're definitely giving a little bit some more power to the federal government, but at the same time, not wanting to take away a lot of kind of rights from the states. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this kind of video here. I'm going to play these periodically. They're kind of corny at a time, but I think they do a pretty good job of kind of explaining things. These kind of what they call crash course. They have crash courses on history where John Green does it, and they crash courses on like all these other subjects and that. This one's a crash course. It's a little corny.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to talk about a fundamental concept in American government, federalism. I'm not sorry, you're not even endangered anymore. Federalism is a little confusing because it includes the word federal as in federal government, which is what we use to describe the government of the United States as a whole, which is kind of the opposite of what we mean when we say federalism. Confused? Google it. This video will probably come up, and then just watch this video, or just continue watching this video. So what is federalism? Most simply, it's the idea that in the US, governmental power is divided between the government of the United States and the government of the individual states. The government of the US, the national government, is sometimes called the federal government, while the state governments are just called the state governments. This is because technically the US can be considered a federation of states, but this means different things to different people. For instance, federation of states means ham sandwich to me. I'll have one federation of states, please. Side of tater tots. Thank you. I'm kind of dumb. In a federal system, the national government takes care of some things, like, for example, war with other countries and delivering the mail, while the state government takes care of other things like driver's license, hunter's license, barber's license, dentist license, license to kill. That's James Bond, and that's in England, and that I hope states don't do that. Pretty simple, right? Maybe not. For one thing, there are some aspects of government that are handled by both the state and the national government. Taxes. Americans' favorite government activity are an example. There are federal taxes and state taxes. But it gets even more complicated because there are different types of federalism depending on what period in American history you're talking about. Stan, why is history so confusing? Stan, can you tell me? Can you me talk, Steve? Basically, though, there are two main types of federalism. Dual federalism, which has nothing to do with Aaron Burr, usually refers to the period of American history that stretches from the founding of our great nation until the New Deal. And cooperative federalism, which has been the rule since the 1930s. Let's start with an easy one and look at dual federalism in the thought bubble. From 1788 until 1937, the U.S. basically lived under a regime of dual federalism, which meant government power was strictly divided between the state and national governments. Notice I didn't say separated because I don't want you to confuse federalism with separation of powers. Don't do it! With dual federalism, there are some things that only the federal government does and some things that only the state governments do. This is sometimes called jurisdiction. The national government had jurisdiction over internal improvements like interstate roads and canals, subsidies to the states, and tariffs, which are taxes on imports and thus fall under the general heading of foreign policy. The national government also owns public lands and regulates patents, which need to be national for them to offer protection for inventors in all the states. And because you want a silver dollar in Delaware to be worth the same as a silver dollar in Georgia, the national government also controls currency. The state government had control over property laws, inheritance laws, commercial laws, banking laws, corporate laws, insurance, family law, which means marriage and divorce, morality, stuff like public lewdness and drinking, keeps me in check, public health, education, criminal laws, including determining what is a crime and how crimes are prosecuted, land use, which includes water and mineral rights, elections, local government, and licensing of professions and occupations. Basically what's required to drive a car, or open a bar, or become a barber, or become James Bond. So, under dual federalism, the state government has jurisdiction over a lot more than the national government. These powers over health, safety, and morality are sometimes called police power, and usually belong to the states. Because of the strict division between the two types of government, dual federalism is sometimes called layer cake federalism. Delicious. And it's consistent with the tradition of limited government that many Americans hold very dear. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, some of you might be wondering, Craig, where does the national government get the power to do anything that has to do with states? Yeah, well, off the top of my head, the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This is what's known as the Commerce Clause, and the way that it's been interpreted forms the basis of dual federalism and cooperative federalism. For most of the 19th century, the Supreme Court decided that almost any attempt by any government, federal or state, to regulate state economic activity would violate the Commerce Clause. This basically meant that there was very little regulation of business at all. Freedom! And this is how things stood, with the U.S. following a system of dual federalism with very little government regulation, and the national government not doing much other than going to war, buying or conquering enormous amounts of territory, and delivering the mail. Then the Great Depression happened, and Franklin Roosevelt and Congress enacted the New Deal, which changed the role of the federal government in a big way. The New Deal brought us cooperative federalism, where the national government encourages states and localities to pursue nationally defined goals. The main way that the federal government does this is through dollar bills, y'all. Money is what I'm saying. Stan, can I make it rain? Yeah? All right, I'm doing it. I happen to have cash in my hand right now. Oh yeah, take my federal money, states. Regulate me a regulator. This money that the federal government gives to the state is called a grant and aid. Grants and aid can work like a carrot, encouraging a state to adopt a certain policy, or work like a stick when the federal government withholds funds if a state doesn't do what the national government wants. Grants and aid are usually called categorical because they're given to states for a particular purpose, like transportation or education or alleviating poverty. There are two types of categorical grants and aid: formula grants and project grants. Under a formula grant, a state gets aid in a certain amount of money based on a mathematical formula. The best example of this is the old way welfare was given in the U.S. under the program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC. States got a certain amount of money for every person who was classified as poor. The more poor people a state had, the more money it got. Project grants require states to submit proposals in order to receive aid. The states compete for a limited pool of resources. Nowadays, project grants are more common than formula grants, but neither is as popular as block grants, which the government gives out Lego blocks and then you build stuff with the Legos. It's a good time. No, where the national government gives a state a huge chunk of money for something big like infrastructure, which is made with concrete and steel, not Legos, and the state is allowed to figure out how to spend the money. The basic type of cooperative federalism is the carrot stick type, which is sometimes called marble cake federalism because it mixes up the state and federal governments in ways that makes it impossible to separate the two. Federalism, it's such a culinary delight. The key to this is, you guessed it, dollar bills, y'all, money. But there's another aspect of cooperative federalism that's really not so cooperative, and that's regulated federalism. Under regulated federalism, the national government sets up regulations and rules that the states must follow. Some examples of these rules, also called mandates, are EPA regulations, civil rights standards, and the rules set up by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Sometimes the government gives the states money to implement the rules, but sometimes it doesn't, and they must comply anyway. That's called an unfunded mandate, or as I like to call it, an unfun mandate, because no money, no fun. A good example of this is OSHA regulations that employers have to follow. States don't like these, and Congress tried to do something about them with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, or UMRA, but it hasn't really worked. In the early 21st century, Americans are basically living under a system of cooperative federalism with some areas of activity that are heavily regulated. This is a stretch from the original idea that federalism will keep the national government small and have most government functions belong to the states. If you follow American politics, and I know you do, this small government ideal should sound familiar because it's the bedrock principle of many conservatives and libertarians in the US. As conservatives made major political inroads after the 1970s, a new concept of federalism, which was actually kind of an old concept of federalism, became popular. It was called, surprise, New Federalism, and it was popularized by Presidents Nixon and Reagan. Just to be clear, it's called New Federalism, not surprise, New Federalism. New federalism basically means giving more power to the states, and this has been done in 3 ways. First, block grants allow states discretion to decide what to do with federal money. And what's a better way to express your power than spending money, or not spending money, as the case may be. Another form of new federalism is devolution, which is the process of giving state and local governments the power to enforce regulations, devolving power from the national to the state level. Finally, some courts have picked up the cause of new federalism through cases based on the 10th Amendment, which states, "The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." The idea that some powers, like those police powers I talked about before, are reserved by the states has been used to put something of a brake on the Commerce Clause. So as you can see, where we are with federalism today is kind of complicated. Presidents Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Clinton seem to favor new federalism and block grants. But George W. Bush seemed to push back towards regulated federalism with laws like No Child Left Behind and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. It's pretty safe to say that we're going to continue to live under a regime of cooperative federalism with a healthy dose of regulation thrown in. But many Americans feel that the national government is too big and expensive and not what the framers wanted. If history is any guide, a system of dual federalism with most of the government in the hands of the states is probably not going to happen. For some reason, it's really difficult to convince institutions to give up powers once they've got them. I'm never giving up this power. Thanks for watching. I'll see you.
All right. So in the sense here, when they talk about like the basic foundation of federalism, the idea of kind of national and state governments sharing powers and having their own specific power. All right, and so in that Venn diagram there, like each of those national powers, like obviously maintaining a military, declaring war, those are for the federal government. For the state governments, like things like your driver's license, you know, you say it's issued by a state. Just in the news, the whole idea of kind of even like in like federal elections, like presidential elections, the states are the ones who run those governments. And then each of them have these powers that they both have, like collecting taxes. That's why in your kind of if you're working, you see like you'll have like taxes taken out of your check, like federal and state taxes. So what you see here is what they call delegated powers. These are powers given specifically to the federal government, to like the idea of kind of like declaring war, establishing post offices, and then you have reserve powers. These are the powers that are held strictly by the states, hunting licenses, marriage licenses, things like that. And then also like kind of incorporation, like kind of if you want to like start a business, you have to be kind of incorporated by the state, stuff like that. So delegated is basically delegated in the Constitution, given specifically to the federal government. Reserve powers, and those are also like kind of like embedded kind of in a vague term within the 9th and 10th Amendments of the Constitution. And then the kind of like the one in which they both kind of like share the powers are referred to as concurrent powers. Powers of the federal state both kind of share. The idea of taxation, regulating commerce. So these are what they call it. They're the ones that were in the middle of the Venn diagram there. So throughout the kind of Constitution, we talk about certain things, like, and a lot of times some of these, like kind of like I said, the video was talking about the concept of federalism has changed a bit over time from like the kind of framers where dual federalism gives the states a little bit more kind of power, and then the kind of the cooperative ones, it's the New Deal. There's been a little bit of going back and forth with that. Tends to be like kind of like Democrats tend to kind of favor the kind of cooperative version, and then Republicans usually do the dual one. All right, so tomorrow I'm gonna kind of talk about like kind of get into like some of the aspects of kind of the structure of the Constitution. We'll talk about like kind of various articles and what those articles kind of like pertain to. Remember, if you did not get that test done, make sure you get it done by today so I can get it in the grade book. Did you guys get that at home?
I missed the 2 before the last.
I'm sorry, you missed what?
I missed the 2 before the last.
Okay, let me go back. Right there? Delegated and reserve?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yep. All right, see you guys tomorrow. Like I said, if you didn't take the test yet, make sure you get that test in by today.
I joined around 8:15. I don't
Okay.
know if you saw.
I'm gonna post the recording of this.
Okay.
So yeah, you can go back. No
Thank you.
worries. Okay.